Welcome Elizabeth Warren, Chairman of the Oversight Committee that is tasked with scrutinizing how the Treasury Department has spent $700 billion to shore up our failing financial institutions. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So the first thing I want to ask you is you are about to become a household name. You are one of the heroines you're being described of Michael Moore's new movie, which derides capitalism and goes after our economic structures. There's a wonderful moment in the movie where he asks you where the $700 billion is, and you look at him and you say, I don't know. So the question is, this is not for lack of trying, I take it, why don't you know?
Well, we don't know where the $700 billion is because the system was initially designed to make sure that we didn't know. When Secretary Paulson first put this money out into the banks, he didn't ask for what are you going to do with it. He didn't put any restrictions on it. He didn't put any tabs on where it was going to go. In other words, he didn't ask. And if you don't ask, no one tells. And so we have a system that originally put more than $200 billion into the financial institutions, basically saying, just take it.
We're just past the year anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, where a lot of safeguards were ostensibly put in place. The TARP money went out. Are we, as an economic nation, are we better off systemically now? Have we put things in place to prevent this from happening?
This really has me worried. A year ago, when we talked about why we needed to pass the TARP, why we needed $700 billion blank check written to the Secretary of Treasury, remember what we were saying. We said the big crisis is toxic assets on the books of the banks. Today, the banks still have those toxic assets.
So what I hear you saying is that we're still facing a fairly fragile economy.
The way I see it is that the financial system itself is quite fragile, and the underlying economy, the real economy, jobs, housing, household wealth, is still in a very perilous state.
I was reading a transcript of a hearing that you conducted with Secretary Geithner, and you had a very good question, which was, why is it that the banking institutions and the automobile companies were treated differently, that the criteria for receiving the funds was very different? And I'm not sure he ever answered it.
If he answered it, I didn't catch it. But this isn't a political cheap shot that I was engaged in. I want to understand, if it's taxpayer money on the line, if these are described as systemically significant institutions, and that's the reason for coming in, did he think the banks were better run? The Treasury Department, on behalf of the taxpayer, was tough in dealing with the auto industry. Some still think maybe we shouldn't have gone in at all, but I want to make the point, they were tough. They were not tough with the banks, and I want to understand why.
On the banks, this notion of too big to fail, why can't they fail?
My view is any institution that is too big to fail is one that distorts the economy and ultimately is very costly to all of us.
Are we going to look back in 2-3 years at this TARP expenditure and say, well, it worked. It had its, what it was supposed to do, its short-term effect?
What was so astonishing about the first expenditures under TARP was that taxpayer dollars were put into financial institutions that were still left all of their shareholders intact, that were still paying dividends, that paid their creditors 100 cents on the dollar. We put taxpayer money in without saying, you've got to use up everyone else's money first. And once that's the case, I don't know how you ever put the genie back in the bottle. I don't know how you ever persuade either a large corporation or the wider marketplace that if you can just get big enough and tie yourself to enough other important people, institutions, that if something goes wrong, the taxpayer will be there behind you. That's a game changer. That is a whole different approach than any we've ever used before.
What more can we be doing to protect the middle class, to protect what Michael Moore refers to as the American dream?
Oh, The answer is we're in trouble on so many fronts. In the 1950s and the 1960s, coming out of World War II, we said as a government, as a people, what can we do to support the middle class? That's what FHA was, to help people get into homes, right? VA, GI loans, on education. We looked at policies by whether or not they strengthen and support the middle class. Somewhere that began to change in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the middle class instead became like a resource to be pulled from. They became the turkey at the Thanksgiving dinner. Who could carve off a piece? Who could get this little piece? Who could make a profit from this piece and that piece, or squeeze down on the wages? And the middle class has gotten shakier and shakier, hollowed out. The consequences of that are far more than economic. The middle class is what makes us who we are. It affects the poor. A strong and vital middle class is a middle class that can offer a helping hand to the poor. A strong and vital middle class is a middle class that has room, is creating new jobs to suck the poor up out of poverty and into middle class positions. The middle class is what gives us political stability. It's what gives us an America that's all bought into the whole process. That what we do is not just about a handful of folks at the top who profit from it. We all profit from it, and that's why we work, and that's why we vote, and that's why we accept the outcome of elections, and that's why we're safe to walk our streets, because we have a middle class for which this ultimately works, this country. And every time we hollow that out, every time we take away a little piece of that, we run the risk that some of what we understood as America, some of what we know as America, begins to die. That's what scares me.